You're late again. You know exactly what time you need to leave. You've set alarms. You've told yourself 100 times that today will be different. But somehow, inexplicably, you're still rushing out the door 10 minutes behind schedule. Heart racing, already crafting the apology text in your mind. And the worst part? You're not sure why this keeps happening. You're not lazy. You're crazy. You care about people. You know being late is inconvenient. So why can't you just leave on time? Here's what most people don't understand. Chronic lateness is rarely about time management. It's not about caring less or trying less. It's about how your brain processes time, manages emotions, and responds to the structure of modern life. And the reasons you're always late might reveal something profound about how your mind works, something you've never fully understood about yourself. Today, we're going to explore the hidden psychology of chronic lateness. Not the surface-level explanations, but the deep neurological, emotional, and psychological mechanisms that make some people perpetually behind schedule. And what we'll discover is that your lateness isn't a character flaw. It's a window into your brain's unique wiring, your emotional patterns, and perhaps into unmet needs you didn't even know you had. Let's begin by understanding something fundamental. Your brain doesn't experience time the way a clock does. The psychology of lateness, when your brain lies about time. Time is one of the strangest things your brain has to process. Unlike vision or hearing, which have dedicated sensory organs, time perception is constructed by your brain from multiple neural systems working together. It's an inference, an educated guess, a story your brain tells itself about duration and sequence. And for some people, that story is consistently, persistently wrong. Neuroscientist Warren Meck's research at Duke University has shown that time perception involves a complex network, including the basal ganglia, prefrontal cortex, and cerebellum. When these regions communicate efficiently, you have accurate time sense. When they don't, minutes can feel like seconds, and you genuinely believe you have more time than you do. This isn't denial or wishful thinking. Your internal clock is literally running at a different speed than external reality. This phenomenon is called time blindness, and it's particularly common in people with ADHD, but it exists on a spectrum that affects many people to varying degrees. If you've ever been completely absorbed in something and looked up shocked that 2 hours passed, you've experienced mild time blindness. For chronically late people, this happens constantly, but they don't realize it's happening. Imagine your internal sense of time is like a watch that runs 15% slow. You think 5 minutes have passed, but it's actually been 6 or 7. Over the course of getting ready, those little discrepancies accumulate. You genuinely believe you were on schedule because your internal experience told you that you were. The world's clock says you're late. Your brain's clock says you're fine. You trust your brain, and you're wrong every time. But time blindness is only part of the story. There's also what psychologists call the planning fallacy, a cognitive bias identified by Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky. The planning fallacy is our tendency to underestimate how long tasks will take, even when we have extensive past experience showing our estimates are wrong. You've gotten ready for work 500 times. You know logically how long it takes. But when you're planning your morning, your brain focuses on the best-case scenario. Everything goes perfectly, no interruptions, maximum efficiency. Your brain conveniently forgets about the times you couldn't find your keys, or the traffic was bad, or you had to go back for something you forgot. Why does your brain do this? Because optimism feels better than realism. Your brain is motivated to maintain a positive emotional state, and imagining that everything will go smoothly creates less anxiety than realistically accounting for obstacles. Psychologist Roy Baumeister's research on optimism bias shows that people consistently overestimate their abilities and underestimate obstacles. Not because they're stupid, but because optimism serves psychological functions like maintaining motivation and reducing anxiety. For chronically late people, this optimism bias is cranked up high. Every morning, your brain presents you with the fantasy version of getting ready. You'll shower quickly, dress efficiently, leave with time to spare. The realistic version, informed by hundreds of past experiences, would factor in the inevitable delays. But realistic planning triggers anxiety, and your brain, trying to protect you from that anxiety, offers instead a comforting delusion. Then there's the reward-seeking aspect of lateness that most people never consider. Your brain runs on dopamine, the neurotransmitter associated with reward, motivation, and pleasure. Dopamine doesn't just respond to rewards you receive. It responds to the anticipation of rewards. And here's where lateness becomes psychologically complex. The rush of almost being late, the adrenaline of hurrying, the drama of barely making it. These create a dopamine spike that your brain finds compelling. Neuroscientist Robert Sapolsky's work on stress and reward shows that our brains can become addicted to stress itself when stress is paired with resolution. The panic of running late, followed by the relief of arriving, creates a neurochemical cycle that's actually reinforcing. Your brain learns that lateness equals excitement, and excitement feels more alive than the boring predictability of arriving early. You're not consciously choosing this, but on a neurological level, your brain has learned that lateness comes with a reward. This is particularly true for people who find routine and structure emotionally deadening. If you're someone who feels stifled by predictability, who craves novelty and stimulation, being precisely on time might feel psychologically wrong, like you're suppressing something vital about yourself. Lateness becomes a small rebellion, a way of injecting spontaneity and aliveness into a world that feels too controlled. Psychologist Harriet Breiker's research on passive-aggressive behavior suggests that for some people, chronic lateness is an unconscious form of asserting autonomy. If you grew up in an environment where you had little control, where authority figures controlled your time and schedule rigidly, lateness as an adult becomes a way of saying, "You can't control me anymore." You're not consciously thinking this. But emotionally, being on time feels like submission, and lateness feels like freedom. Then there's the perfectionism paradox. You might assume perfectionists are always early, everything planned and controlled. But perfectionism often causes lateness because the perfectionist can't leave until everything is exactly right. You're not late because you don't care. You're late because you care too much. You couldn't find the right outfit. The email you were sending needed one more revision. You had to clean up that one thing before leaving. Each delay is driven by the anxiety that if everything isn't perfect, something bad will happen or you'll be judged negatively. Psychologist Thomas Greenspan's work on perfectionism shows that perfectionistic anxiety often manifests as procrastination and lateness, because the fear of imperfection prevents starting or finishing tasks efficiently. If you can't do something perfectly, you delay doing it at all. And since perfection is impossible, you're always delaying, always running behind. All of these mechanisms, time blindness, planning fallacy, dopamine-seeking, autonomy assertion, perfectionism, often work together, creating a complex psychological system where lateness isn't a simple bad habit, but an expression of how your brain processes time, emotion, and control. Understanding this doesn't excuse lateness when it impacts others, but it does reframe it. You're not being selfish or disrespectful. You're struggling with neurological and psychological patterns that are much harder to change than simply trying harder. The different types of chronically late people. Not all lateness is the same. When we look deeper into the psychology, we find distinct patterns, different types of people whose lateness comes from fundamentally different places. Recognizing your type is the first step toward understanding what's really happening. There's the optimist, the person whose lateness comes from a genuinely cheerful belief that they can fit more into time than physically possible. The optimist looks at a 15-minute window and thinks, "I can answer these emails, make coffee, call my mom, and still leave on time." They're not being delusional intentionally. Their brain genuinely perceives tasks as taking less time than they do, and their optimistic temperament makes them believe they can accomplish more than reality allows. Psychologist Martin Seligman's research on optimism shows that optimistic people have different cognitive patterns around future events. They focus on positive possibilities and minimize obstacles. For the optimist, this manifests as time optimism, the belief that everything will go smoothly, efficiently, perfectly. They've been late 1,000 times before, but each morning, their brain presents the fantasy that today will be different, and they believe it. The optimist isn't being inconsiderate. They're being betrayed by their own positive expectations. When they arrive late, they're often genuinely surprised, authentically confused about where the time went. It should have only taken 10 minutes, they say, and they really believe that. Their internal experience doesn't match external reality, and they trust their internal experience because it feels true. Then there's the thrill seeker, someone whose lateness is driven by the psychological need for stimulation and excitement. The thrill seeker finds being on time boring. Arriving with time to spare feels wrong, unstimulating, like wasted potential for drama. They need the adrenaline rush of cutting it close, the intensity of hurrying, the relief of barely making it. Psychologist Marvin Zuckerman's research on sensation-seeking personality traits shows that some people have higher needs for novel, intense experiences. For these individuals, routine and predictability feel psychologically aversive. Lateness becomes a way of creating excitement in mundane situations. The morning commute is boring. The morning commute, when you're running late and every light matters, becomes engaging. The thrill seeker often doesn't realize this is what they're doing. They might consciously say they want to be on time, but unconsciously, they're engineering lateness because their nervous system craves the activation. When they do arrive early, they feel restless, almost anxious, because their arousal level is too low. The avoider is late for a completely different reason. They don't want to arrive. Something about the destination creates anxiety, dread, or resistance. It might be a job they hate, a social situation that makes them uncomfortable, a family gathering that triggers stress. The lateness isn't about time management, it's about emotional management. Delaying arrival is delaying the unpleasant experience. Psychologist Joseph Ferrari's research on procrastination shows that avoidance-based delay is a way of regulating negative emotions. If going to work triggers anxiety, being late means less time at work, which means less time feeling anxious. The lateness is serving a protective function, even though it creates other problems. The avoider might not consciously realize they're avoiding. They might not even consciously dislike the destination. But their behavior reveals what their emotions know. Some part of them doesn't want to be there. And lateness is a compromise between the obligation to go and the desire to not go. The overwhelmed type is late because their psychological resources are depleted. They're not managing time poorly because they don't care. They're managing time poorly because managing anything feels impossible right now. They might be depressed, burned out, dealing with trauma, or simply carrying too much stress. Lateness is a symptom of a larger psychological state where executive function is compromised. Psychologist Roy Baumeister's research on ego depletion shows that willpower and executive control are limited resources. When you're psychologically overwhelmed, the cognitive energy required to plan, organize, and execute getting somewhere on time exceeds your available capacity. It's not that you're not trying. It's that trying requires more than you have to give right now. The ADHD type experiences lateness differently again. For people with ADHD, time perception is fundamentally impaired. Neurologist Russell Barkley describes ADHD as a disorder of time blindness and executive dysfunction. People with ADHD struggle to estimate time, to sequence tasks, to inhibit distractions, to sustain attention on boring but necessary activities like leaving on time. Their lateness isn't a choice or a personality flaw. It's a neurological reality. They might use every time management technique available and still struggle because the underlying issue is how their brain processes temporal information and manages complex sequences of behavior. When they're absorbed in something interesting, hours disappear. When they're trying to do something boring like getting ready to leave, every minute feels eternal and they lose track of the actual passage of time. Finally, there's the perfectionist we mentioned earlier, whose lateness stems from an inability to leave until everything meets impossibly high standards. The perfectionist is often anxious, conscientious, and deeply worried about judgment from others. They're late, not because they don't care about others' time, but because they care too much about others' perception of them. They can't leave until they look right, until the email is perfect, until everything is just so. Each of these types experiences lateness differently, and each requires different approaches to change. The optimist needs better time estimation tools. The thrill seeker needs to find healthier sources of stimulation. The avoider needs to address what they're avoiding. The overwhelmed needs support and reduce demands. The ADHD type needs neurological accommodation strategies, and the perfectionist needs to work on anxiety and impossible standards. Understanding your type means understanding what lateness is doing for you, what need it's meeting, what function it's serving. Because lateness is rarely just lateness. It's always revealing something deeper about how you're functioning psychologically. The biology and evolution of time perception. Let's go even deeper into why some brains struggle with punctuality by examining the biological and evolutionary roots of time perception. Because the way you experience time isn't just psychological, it's neurological, hormonal, and evolutionary. Your brain doesn't have a single clock for time perception. Instead, it has multiple timing systems that operate at different scales. There's circadian timing, which tracks the 24-hour day-night cycle. There's interval timing, which tracks durations from seconds to hours. And there's millisecond timing, which coordinates rapid motor sequences. These systems involve different neural circuits, and when they don't work together seamlessly, time perception becomes distorted. Neuroscientist Joseph Paton's research at the Champalimaud Center shows that interval timing, the kind you need to arrive on time, depends heavily on dopamine signaling in the basal ganglia. Why? When dopamine levels are off, either too high or too low, time perception skews. People with ADHD, who have altered dopamine function, consistently perceive time as passing slower during boring tasks and faster during engaging tasks. This isn't imagination. It's neurochemistry. Stress hormones also dramatically affect time perception. When you're stressed, cortisol and adrenaline change how your brain processes temporal information. Psychologist Sylvie Droyvolet's research shows that anxiety makes time feel like it's passing slower in the moment, but faster in retrospect. If you're chronically stressed or anxious, your time perception is chronically distorted, making it genuinely harder to estimate how long things take. There's also individual variation in what neuroscientists call clock speed, the rate at which your internal timing mechanisms operate. Some people have faster internal clocks. Time feels like it's passing quickly, and they consistently overestimate how much they can accomplish. Others have slower internal clocks. Time feels like it's dragging, and they're often early because their sense of duration is elongated. These aren't choices. These are biological variations in how brains process temporal information, similar to how some people are naturally better at spatial reasoning or language. Just as you wouldn't blame someone for being bad at math due to how their brain is wired, we shouldn't assume lateness is always a choice rather than a neurological difference. From an evolutionary perspective, time perception is a relatively recent cognitive demand. For most of human history, survival didn't depend on being somewhere at exactly 9 a.m. Our ancestors needed to track seasonal changes and daily light cycles, but minute-to-minute precision wasn't necessary. The modern world's obsession with punctuality is evolutionarily novel, and our brains aren't necessarily optimized for it. Anthropologist Edward Hall's research on cultural concepts of time shows that strict punctuality is actually a Western industrial invention, tied to factory work and train schedules. In many cultures, time is treated much more fluidly. The idea that being 10 minutes late is disrespectful is culturally constructed, not universal. This doesn't mean punctuality doesn't matter in contexts where it does matter, but it does mean that our brains weren't designed for the level of temporal precision modern life demands. Some evolutionary psychologists suggest that individual variation in time urgency might have been adaptive in ancestral environments. A group benefits from having some members who are urgent and time-conscious, and others who are more relaxed and present-focused. The urgent types ensure the group doesn't miss opportunities or face time-sensitive dangers. The relaxed types ensure the group doesn't burn out from constant rushing and can fully engage with immediate experiences. From this perspective, your lateness might not be a bug. It might be a feature, a cognitive style that was adaptive in different contexts, but creates friction in a world organized around industrial punctuality. This doesn't solve the problem of lateness in modern life, but it does reframe it. You're not broken. You're wired for a different relationship with time than what your culture demands. The emotional roots of chronic lateness. Beyond neurology and evolution, there are deep emotional patterns that drive chronic lateness. These patterns are often unconscious, rooted in childhood experiences, attachment styles, and unresolved psychological needs. Understanding these emotional roots is crucial because you can't change a behavior without understanding what it's protecting you from or providing for you. For some people, lateness is a fear of starting. Beginning something, especially something important or anxiety-provoking, triggers overwhelming feelings. Lateness is a way of postponing the start, of buying a few more minutes before you have to face whatever is waiting. Psychologist Timothy P. Schill's research on procrastination shows that avoidance of starting is often about fear of failure, fear of judgment, fear of the task itself. When you're late to work, you're postponing the moment when work actually begins. When you're late to a social event, you're postponing the moment when you have to engage socially. The lateness isn't about disorganization, it's about the emotional difficulty of transitioning into the next thing. Conversely, some people's lateness is about fear of finishing. If you struggle with perfectionism or have anxiety about closure, you might delay leaving because leaving means the preparation phase ends and the performance phase begins. As long as you're still getting ready, you're in a liminal space where you don't have to fully commit. The moment you arrive, you're accountable, visible, being evaluated. Psychologist Bluma Zygarnik's research on task completion shows that unfinished tasks create psychological tension. For some people, this tension is motivating. For others, it's protective. Staying in the almost ready phase means never having to face the completion and its consequences. There's also rebellion embedded in chronic lateness for many people. If you grew up in an environment where authority was rigid, controlling, or punitive, lateness as an adult can be an unconscious way of asserting that no one controls you anymore. You're not consciously thinking I'll be late to prove I'm autonomous. But emotionally, being constrained by schedules feels like being controlled, and lateness is a small daily declaration of independence. Psychologist Virginia Satir's work on family systems shows that patterns learned in childhood often persist into adulthood as automatic responses. If being on time in childhood meant submitting to harsh authority, your adult nervous system might react to punctuality with resistance, even when the current context is completely different. For others, lateness is tied to low self-worth. If you don't believe you matter, you might unconsciously behave as though your time doesn't matter either. Being late is a way of treating yourself as less important than others, of putting your needs last, of not believing you deserve to take up space or have your presence matter. Psychologist Kristen Neff's research on self-compassion shows that people with low self-worth often engage in self-sabotaging behaviors that confirm their negative self-concept. Lateness becomes evidence that you're not competent, not reliable, not worthy of respect, reinforcing the internal story you tell about yourself. Then there's the overwhelm factor we touched on earlier, but let's go deeper. For people who are depressed, anxious, traumatized, or burned out, lateness is often a symptom of executive dysfunction. The psychological energy required to plan, organize, and execute. Getting somewhere on time exceeds available resources. Depression slows cognitive processing and reduces motivation. Anxiety creates paralysis and rumination. Trauma disrupts executive function. Burnout depletes willpower. In these states, lateness isn't a choice. It's a symptom of deeper psychological distress that needs addressing. Understanding these emotional roots means recognizing that just leave earlier isn't helpful advice. If your lateness is rooted in fear of starting, rebellion against control, low self-worth, or overwhelm, setting an earlier alarm won't solve anything. You need to address the underlying emotional pattern driving the behavior. What chronic lateness really means about you. So, after all this psychology, neurology, and emotional analysis, what does chronic lateness actually reveal about you as a person? The answer is complex, but it's important to separate what lateness means from what it doesn't mean. What lateness doesn't mean, it doesn't necessarily mean you're selfish, disrespectful, or that you don't value other people's time. These are common judgments, but they're often wrong. Most chronically late people feel terrible about being late, apologize profusely, and genuinely wish they could change. Their lateness isn't because they don't care. It's because they're struggling with something deeper. Lateness also doesn't mean you're lazy or unmotivated. Many chronically late people are highly productive in other areas of life. They might be successful professionals, creative artists, dedicated parents. Their lateness exists alongside, not because of, their work ethic. And lateness doesn't mean you're a bad person. Character and punctuality are separate things. Some of the kindest, most generous people struggle with lateness. Some of the most punctual people are rigid, judgmental, or controlling. Timeliness is one small aspect of how someone functions, not a measure of their worth. What lateness might mean? It might mean you have different neurology, particularly around time perception and executive function. It might mean you're optimistic to a fault, always believing you can accomplish more than you can. It might mean you're seeking stimulation in a life that feels understimulated. It might mean you're avoiding something that creates anxiety or discomfort. It might mean you're overwhelmed, carrying more psychological weight than you have resources to manage. It might mean you learned patterns in childhood about control, autonomy, and authority that now manifest as lateness. It might mean you're perfectionistic, unable to leave until everything meets impossible standards. Lateness might be a coping mechanism, an unconscious strategy for managing difficult emotions or situations. It might be a form of self-sabotage rooted in low self-worth. It might be a small daily rebellion against a world that feels too controlling. Or it might simply be that your brain processes time differently than the clock on the wall, and you're doing your best to navigate a world designed for neurologies different from yours. Psychologist Dan McAdams' research on narrative identity shows that the stories we tell about ourselves shape our behavior. If you've internalized the story that you're just a late person, that identity becomes self-fulfilling. But if you understand the specific mechanisms driving your lateness, you can write a different story, one where you're not fundamentally flawed, but rather facing specific challenges that have specific solutions. The meaning of your lateness is unique to you. It requires honest self-reflection to determine which mechanisms are operating in your situation. Are you avoiding something? Seeking stimulation? Struggling with time perception? Operating from childhood patterns? Overwhelmed by current life demands? Understanding the specific function your lateness serves is the key to addressing it effectively. Practical solutions. Addressing the root cause. Now that we understand the complex psychology of lateness, let's talk about solutions. But these aren't generic time management tips. These are specific strategies matched to the underlying psychological and neurological causes we've explored. If your lateness is rooted in time blindness, you need external time tracking. Your internal sense of time is unreliable, so you can't trust it. Use timers obsessively. Set an alarm for when you need to start getting ready, another for when you need to leave, another for 5 minutes before you need to leave. Use visual timers that show time passing, not just digital clocks. The time timer products, which use a colored disc that shrinks as time passes, help many people with ADHD and time blindness because they make time visible and concrete rather than abstract. Build in buffer time that accounts for your planning fallacy. If you think something takes 30 minutes, plan for 45. You're not being pessimistic, you're being realistic about your optimistic bias. Your brain will always underestimate, so compensate systematically. For the thrill seeker who needs stimulation, find other sources of excitement that don't involve being late. If your nervous system craves activation, give it activation in healthier ways. Exercise before you need to leave. Listen to energizing music. Build in challenges that aren't about cutting it close with time. Your need for stimulation is legitimate. Lateness is just a maladaptive way of meeting it. If you're the avoider, address what you're avoiding. If you hate your job, being late doesn't solve that. Finding a new job or finding meaning in your current job does. If social situations trigger anxiety, being late doesn't help. Working on social anxiety does. Lateness is a symptom, not a solution. Treating the symptom without addressing the cause just creates suffering without change. For the overwhelmed, reduce demands and increase support. You can't time manage your way out of being psychologically depleted. You need to address the underlying burnout, depression, or overwhelm. This might mean therapy, medication, lifestyle changes, boundary setting, or asking for help. When your psychological resources are restored, time management becomes possible again. If perfectionism drives your lateness, practice good enough. Set a timer for getting ready, and when it goes off, leave, even if everything isn't perfect. Deliberately practice leaving when things are imperfect to retrain your nervous system that the feared consequence of imperfection doesn't actually occur. Cognitive behavioral therapy techniques for perfectionism can be transformative here. For ADHD-related lateness, use external structure aggressively. Phone alarms, written checklists, accountability partners, body doubling, having someone present while you get ready, even virtually, and ADHD-friendly planning systems. The How to ADHD channel on YouTube has excellent specific strategies. ADHD coaching can also be invaluable because someone with expertise can help you build systems that work with your neurology rather than against it. Address childhood patterns through therapy if lateness is tied to rebellion, control issues, or low self-worth. These roots require psychological work, not time management strategies. Understanding why you unconsciously resist punctuality allows you to make conscious choices rather than being driven by unexamined patterns. One universally helpful strategy: prepare everything the night before. Clothes laid out, bag packed, keys in a consistent location, lunch made, coffee preset. This eliminates morning decisions and tasks, reducing the cognitive load when you're tired and potentially time blind. Your morning self is not your most capable self. Set up your environment so your morning self has less to manage. Another powerful tool: work backward from arrival time, not forward from wake time. Don't think I wake up at 7, so I'll probably leave around 8. Think I need to arrive at 9, which means leaving at 8:30, which means being fully ready at 8:20, which means starting to get ready at 7:30, which means waking up at 7. This backward planning reduces planning fallacy by anchoring to the fixed constraint, arrival time, rather than the flexible constraint, how long things might take. For emotional regulation issues, develop a morning routine that manages anxiety rather than increasing it. Rushing creates cortisol, which worsens time perception and executive function. If you can wake up earlier and move more slowly, you might paradoxically be on time more often because your nervous system is regulated rather than activated. Consider whether medication might help. But if your lateness is rooted in ADHD, depression, or anxiety, treating the underlying condition might dramatically improve punctuality as a side effect. This isn't about medicating away a bad habit. It's about addressing neurological or psychological conditions that impair executive function. Track your patterns without judgment. Keep a log for 2 weeks: when you aim to leave, when you actually left, what happened in between. This data reveals your specific patterns. Maybe you're always late on Wednesdays because you underestimate morning meeting prep. Maybe you're on time for things you're excited about but late for obligations. The patterns show you where to intervene. Build accountability systems. Tell someone your intended leave time and ask them to check in. Knowing someone else is aware creates social pressure that can override internal resistance. Join or create a punctuality support group, online or in person, where people struggling with lateness support each other. Most importantly, practice self-compassion while working on change. Beating yourself up about lateness doesn't help. It often makes it worse by adding shame to the existing challenges. Psychologist Kristen Neff's research shows that self-compassion actually increases motivation to change because you're moving toward positive goals rather than away from painful self-judgment. Change is possible, but it requires understanding what's really happening beneath the behavior and addressing those root causes rather than just trying harder at the surface level. Conclusion: a new understanding. We've covered a lot of ground today. We've seen that chronic lateness isn't a simple character flaw, but a complex phenomenon involving neurology, psychology, emotion, childhood patterns, and individual differences in how brains process time. We've explored the different types of late people, each struggling with different underlying mechanisms. We've examined the biological and evolutionary contexts that shape time perception. And we've looked at the emotional roots that often drive lateness below conscious awareness. If you're someone who struggles with being on time, I hope this has given you a new framework for understanding yourself. You're not broken. You're not lazy or selfish. You're facing specific challenges that have specific causes and therefore specific solutions. Your lateness is telling you something about how your brain works, what you're avoiding, what needs aren't being met, or what patterns you learned long ago that no longer serve you. And if you're someone who's frustrated with late people in your life, I hope this has created some compassion. That person who's always late to your gatherings isn't doing it to disrespect you. They're struggling with time perception, or executive dysfunction, or anxiety, or patterns they don't fully understand themselves. Their lateness hurts them too. They apologize because they mean it. They want to change, but don't know how. Time is strange. We treat it as absolute and objective, but it's actually subjective and constructed. Your experience of 10 minutes is different from mine, shaped by our different brains, different stress levels, different current psychological states. The modern world demands precision about time that's only been expected for about 150 years. We're asking our ancient brains to perform a very modern trick, and some brains struggle more than others. This doesn't mean lateness doesn't matter. When your lateness impacts others, it creates real harm, wasted time, missed opportunities, damaged trust, inconvenience. Taking responsibility for those impacts is important even while understanding the deeper causes. But responsibility looks different when you understand the mechanism. It's not about trying harder or caring more. It's about building systems, addressing root causes, and working with your neurology rather than fighting it. You can change this pattern. Many people do. But change starts with understanding, and understanding starts with letting go of the story that you're just bad at being on time. You're not bad at it. You're dealing with something complex that has complex causes, and therefore requires complex solutions. So as you move forward from here, be curious about your lateness rather than judgmental. When you're late, ask yourself, what was really happening? Was I avoiding something? Did time feel different than it was? Was I seeking stimulation or rebelling against constraint? Was I overwhelmed or perfectionistic? The answers will guide you toward the specific interventions that will actually help. Be patient with yourself. Changing patterns rooted in neurology, childhood, or deep psychology takes time. You didn't develop this pattern overnight, and you won't change it overnight. But with understanding, compassion, and the right tools, you can develop a new relationship with time, one where you're working with your unique brain rather than constantly fighting against it. And remember, punctuality is only one small measure of a person. It matters in contexts where it matters, but it doesn't define your worth, your character, or your capacity for meaningful relationships and work. You are so much more than your relationship with time. You're working on this because you care about others and want to reduce friction in your life, and that care, that desire to improve, that says far more about who you are than whether you arrive at 9:0 or 9:15. Time will continue to be strange and slippery. Clocks will keep ticking. You'll probably still be late sometimes because you're human and humans are imperfect and life is messy. But now you understand what's really happening when you're late. And understanding is always the first step toward change.